Thank you, Randy. It's interesting when we first started engaging with Albina Vision Trust, which wasn't Albina Vision Trust at that time, about 4 years ago. We really thought this was going to be an inward out kind of vision as it came to be. And as this project and conversations about Portland Public Schools has come up, it's really starting to look like it might be more of an outward in, which is a really interesting dynamic. So the image you see on the screen here, many of you are probably familiar with this. This is 30 years from now, 40 years from now, which is probably enough time to have something major realized in this part of the city. And what I really want you to focus is on the upper left hand of the image. You see that red and white streak there. That's Interstate 5. And it comes in to about where the Moda Center is, and it disappears. And it doesn't reappear until somewhere off the page. And in really the simplest sense, that's what we're after. The idea, as Megan talked about, that when you move through this part of the city, you don't experience this massive gap that is I-5 at the moment. You don't experience that transition of going from one place to another. You're just in a place. You're in Albina. The place for that type of transition is when you reach the river. And that's really where that should happen. And so that's a drastic difference from the current reality. And if you haven't stood here on Flint, you can see the Memorial Coliseum there in the background. If you haven't stood here, you've experienced this over 84, you've experienced this over 405, elsewhere on I-5, somewhere else in the world. This is everywhere in our cities, and I think a big reason why you see a lot of the projects that Randy just went through starting to happen. And we like to think that we can do a little better than this. So you've seen this image, I think, 2 times now. You'll probably see it at least one more in this presentation. So this is the current status of the design, about 5%. And so the thing I want to kind of focus on right now is the general shape of the caps. So there's 2 of them, and it doesn't take too long to look at this and say the thing that's informing the shape of these and how these are configured is the interstate below. And we'd really like to see that dynamic flipped and have the city above really take a leading role. There are certainly constraints from the freeway that we need to consider when putting this together. But the dynamic needs to be a little different. And if you flatten that out, so you see this in plan A is the north cap, B is the lower cap. And what I also want to point out here, both in kind of reference of location and also scale, is that blue triangle there. So for those that have ridden the streetcar through here, that is the streetcar stop at Weidler and Ross. It's the kind of got the spider-like sculpture, multicolored on top of it. And interestingly enough, it's about the same size as each of those triangles of green space you see there. So if you're familiar with that space and you can kind of think of that scale and imagine yourself in a space that's about that size. It's got some grass, a couple benches, a few trees, a little bit of gravel for a pathway, and 2 fences that look out over I-5. And think about the quality of that public space, and then compare that to a public space you like. Pioneer Courthouse Square, Dawson Park, Overlook Park. You can move through these spaces. You can access them from a variety of locations. You have sight lines. You're not necessarily adjacent to a freeway. And then think of some negative spaces. O'Brien Square, which is just across Burnside. It's closed for other reasons right now, but it's got a dead end to it on one side where the garage enters. And that's, from its inception, been a challenge. And so we think about the quality of spaces that get created in the way these caps come together, but we also think about Albina Vision and what it's providing. That waterfront park, which interestingly enough would be a capping project, as Rukaiyah referenced, that would be one of the best spaces in the city without question. And if you want to kind of see that, just go down there. You can walk onto those parking lots. They're nothing but broken up asphalt at the moment. The experience of standing there is incredible. And if you imagine yourself maybe 20, 30 feet higher, above the freight rail, really looking out at concourse level with the VMC, it would be one of the best public spaces on the West Coast. There's a public plaza, there's a smaller across Broadway, there's a smaller, more park block scale. We think the variety in the spaces provided here really minimize the need for that public space to be over the freeway. And so Randy did show this example, Clyde Warren Park, and everything I say is to not imply that green space can't work over a freeway. I actually had an opportunity to be in Dallas end of last year, and so I came here, and you know, Dallas has a lot of urban design problems. If there's a city informed by the car, that's it. This is an 8-lane freeway that it crosses, and I went out here during rush hour. Pickup trucks, 90 miles an hour in every lane, nothing but pickup trucks. And you walk just a few feet into the park. It was incredible. I really didn't expect the experience to be like this, and you really don't know that the freeway's there. It's really quite an achievement. But as Randy noted, it's you know, almost 5.5 acres. That's almost 6 Portland city blocks. So you think about the scale of it, it's contiguous. And then the other thing it has working in its favor is it aligns with the grid. And so it's a lot easier to cover that. You look at the situation that we're looking at here. The freeway, unfortunately, does not align to the grid. And so when you try to take the shortest spans, which would be perpendicular to the freeway, you end up with some of these odd-shaped spaces. So all of that is to say, our feeling is that these caps should really be looked at as potential sites for buildings, and that might be a more meaningful way to use these spaces. Now, we've done a little research, and we've worked with a structural engineer, KPFF engineers based out of Portland, and you know, their review leads us to believe that 1- and 2-story buildings could work on the caps as ODOT currently has them designed, and that with you know, some modifications, and we'd still need to do some work on this, that 5- and 6-story buildings are likely possible. That's not to say they should all be as tall as possible, but more so to say that all of a sudden you now have a range to work with. There's a lot of questions to answer. Who owns the land? Who develops them? Who owns the buildings when they're developed? What kind of spaces should they be? But what we're really looking at is let's not build something that couldn't hold that possibility in the future. And so you can see here when building depths and forms start to shape how these come together, the proportions change a little bit. This is really early work, and you see kind of some odd sites in here, but look at where the city grid comes together in downtown. There's plenty of examples in this city up on Sandy Boulevard where you have these triangular wedge shapes that have been made to be fairly successful. So another image here. This is one of the images from the ODOT materials, and you can see Weidler here. You're on Williams, so this is the really popular bike route. The Madrona Apartments there is on your left, and this is of the public spaces in there, probably the one that has the highest potential. Is, you know, it's close to a full block, and even still, we really think that by starting to bring the city in here, that this really might be a more meaningful way to cross these. So, you know, for us, this is all about, again, not limiting the long-term potential, and also making sure that nothing that happens here precludes Albina Vision from being a reality. It's pretty clear that whatever gets built here in terms of capping is probably a 50 to 100-year solution, and we don't want to be kicking ourselves, even if it takes 20 years for development to come through. We've had some really positive dialogue with ODOT, with PBOT, and we're really encouraged about where that conversation is going. So thank you.